FBI Director James Comey is fired by Trump. Washington, President Trump on Tuesday fired the director of the FBI, James B. Comey, abruptly terminating the top official leading the criminal investigation into whether Mr. Trump's advisors colluded with the Russian government to steer the outcome of the 2016 presidential election. The stunning development in Mr. Trump's presidency raised the specter of political interference by a sitting president into an existing investigation by the nation's leading law enforcement agency. It immediately ignited Democratic calls for a special counsel to lead the Russia inquiry. Mr. Trump explained the firing by citing Mr. Comey's handling of the investigation into Hillary Clinton's use of a private email server, even though the president was widely seen to have benefited politically from that inquiry and had once praised Mr. Comey for his guts in his pursuit of Mrs. Clinton during the campaign. But in his letter to Mr. Comey, released to reporters by the White House, the president betrayed his focus on the continuing inquiry into Russia and his aides. While I greatly appreciate you informing me, on 3 separate occasions, that I am not under investigation, I nevertheless concurred with the judgment of the Department of Justice that you are not able to effectively lead the Bureau, Mr. Trump said in a letter to Mr. Comey dated Tuesday. White House officials refused to say anything more about the 3 occasions Mr. Trump cited. The officials said that Attorney General Jeff Sessions and the Deputy Attorney General, Rod J. Rosenstein, pushed for Mr. Comey's dismissal. But many in Washington, including veteran FBI officers, saw a graft effort by the president to create a pretense for a takedown of the president's FBI tormentor. I cannot defend the director's handling of the conclusion of the investigation of Secretary Clinton's emails, Mr. Rosenstein wrote in another letter that was released by the White House, and I do not understand his refusal to accept the nearly universal judgment that he was mistaken. Reaction in Washington was swift and fierce. Senator Chuck Schumer of New York, the Democratic leader, said the firing could make Americans suspect the cover-up. Mr. Trump flashed back later on Tuesday night in a Twitter post, crying. Chuck Schumer stated recently, "I do not have confidence in him, James Comey, any longer." Then X so indignant. Many Republicans assailed the president for making a rash decision that could have deep implications for their party. Representative Justin Amash, Republican of Michigan, said on Twitter that he now supports an independent commission to investigate the Russia links to Mr. Trump. He called Trump's claim that Mr. Comey had cleared him 3 times bizarre. "I've spent the last several hours trying to find an acceptable rationale for the timing of Comey's firing," Senator Jeff Flake, Republican of Arizona, said on Twitter. "I just can't do it." In a sign of the F.B.I.'s intense interest in Mr. Trump's advisors, the grand jury in Virginia issued subpoenas in recent weeks for records related to the former White House National Security Advisor, Michael T. Flynn, according to an American official familiar with the case. Mr. Flynn is under investigation for his financial ties to Russia and Turkey. Grand jury subpoenas are a routine part of federal investigations and are not a sign that charges are imminent. It was not clear that the subpoenas, which were first reported by CNN, were related to Mr. Comey's firing. The dismissal ended the long deteriorating relationship of Mr. Trump and Mr. Comey, who repeatedly collided publicly and privately. For Mr. Trump, the president who puts a premium on loyalty, Mr. Comey represented an independent and unpredictable director with enormous power to disrupt his administration. Mr. Comey learned from news reports that he had been fired while addressing bureau employees in Los Angeles. While Mr. Comey spoke, television screens in the background began flashing the news. In response to the reports, Mr. Comey laughed, saying that he thought it was a fairly funny prank. Shortly after, Mr. Trump's letter was delivered to FBI headquarters in Washington. Mr. Comey was for years into a 10-year term, an unusually long tenure that Congress established to insulate the director from political pressure. Though the president has the authority to fire the FBI director for any reason, Mr. Comey is only the 2nd director to be fired in bureau history. President Bill Clinton fired William S. Sessions in 1993. Mr. Trump had already fired his acting attorney general for insubordination and his national security advisor for lying to Vice President Mike Pence about contacts with Russians. But firing Mr. Comey raises much deeper questions about the independence of the FBI and the future of its investigations under Mr. Trump. In an instance of bizarre timing and optics, The White House announced late Tuesday night that Mr. Trump would meet on Wednesday in the Oval Office with Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister. The FBI agents were enraged by the firing and worried openly that Mr. Trump would appoint a White House ally to lead them. Mr. Comey was widely liked in the FBI, even by those who criticized his handling of the Clinton investigation. Agents regarded him as a good manager and an independent director,